Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and today on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I share the second half of my interview with Brian Godawa, screenwriter and author of the Chronicles of the Nephilim novels, plus scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this. 2022 is flying by so fast, and I just reviewed my goals for the year. It's not too late to set some effective goals for 2022 for yourself. And the Goal Process 101 ebook helps you do just that. With a straightforward process and practical exercises, you'll be guided to set the right goals for you and set out a plan to achieve them. Get your copy of the Goal Process 101 ebook by going to goalprocess101.com. Use CNU2022 at checkout to save 10%. Now, back to the show. I know I always start with scripture, but today I want the scripture to be closer to the interview, and I think it'll make sense why. So let's get into some nerdy news. This week, Disney Plus has two interesting releases. First, Disney Gallery, The Book of Boba Fett. This will be a short behind-the-scenes documentary-style video about the making of the Boba Fett show. These are always great little vignettes. Definitely always worth watching. And next, we have the finale of Marvel's Moon Knight. I can't wait. Expect my review in the next few weeks. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is releasing this week. Expect a universe-breaking and resetting event kind of movie. We have confirmed that we will see some version of the Illuminati, and that's been confirmed through trailers, and at least one mutant, Professor Xavier himself. Now, of all things, Bruce Campbell is listed in IMDb with no character name. Campbell was set to play Mysterio in Sam Raimi's unmade Spider-Man number 4, and with Raimi directing Doctor Strange 2, it's no huge surprise that Campbell is going to be in this movie. Campbell has hinted that his part may have hit the cutting room floor. We will see. And John Watt, director for all three of the recent Spider-Man films, has recently stepped down from heading up the upcoming Fantastic Four film. Kevin Feige said when asked that he was supportive of his reasons for stepping away. Previous Fantastic Four movies have had lackluster reception over the years, and I'm hopeful having Marvel's first family back in the fold will see something great this time. Well, that's all the nerdy news I have for you right now. Keep an eye on my Instagram at @TheRealRickyPope. I will post more news there as I hear about it. As you recall last week, Brian Godawa and I talked so long, I had to break up the interview into two parts. So if you missed that, definitely go back and check out last week's interview. Brian has been fascinated with the Nephilim and imagining spiritual events surrounding the earthly events in the Bible. So I thought this would be an appropriate scripture to read. Genesis 6, 1-8. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years." The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Well, there are a few different ways to interpret this passage. And in our interview with Brian, he takes some time to explain how he believes it should be understood and why. Let's get right to it. So when we talk about the Nephilim, how do you see that working? What is kind of your take on that, and biblically and any extra biblical study that you've done on it?
Sure. Yeah. So what you're referring to is I'm kind of pulling up my notes here because I'm terrible at remembering verses and all that stuff. So it's a controversial issue, and there are differing views on it. But
Absolutely.
it really was the genesis of me writing all this stuff with my first novel, Noah Primeval. And it was the classic verses, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, when it talks about the sons of God who are in heaven, heavenly divine beings coming to earth and mating with the daughters of men. And then they bore them Nephilim, and the Nephilim is a word that means giants. It's interesting. It's a transliterated word in the Bible. They don't translate it. They transliterate because it's so controversial, right? And there are different interpretations of that. Are these sons of God is that just a phrase referring to, Mesopotamian kings that claim to be that, or is this polygamy, or is this, whatever, just various human beings that are calling themselves sons of God as if they're special, but they're actually evil or something? Or are they spiritual, angelic, divine beings? So there's a long history of debate, and the earliest church fathers did believe they were angelic, divine beings, But I'll grant that it's debated. So I actually have a book on the whole issue called "When Giants Were Upon the Earth," where I try to go through my biblical basis for why I take that argument. I take the position that the sons of God are these angelic. Angel is a sort of a sloppy word, but it also is helpful for organizing people's thoughts. I would call, people will say that are they angels having sex with humans? And the word angel can mean many different things, and it doesn't have to be one kind of thing. But when I use that term, I'm usually referring to divine beings from God's heavenly host, that kind of a thing. So that was the verse that I always just jumped over because it was, wow, that's weird. I don't understand it, and maybe one day I will, but I just keep reading because it doesn't make sense to me, And then when I was doing this research on Noah, I realized, oh my gosh, there's this whole, it almost reads like, it's very similar to a lot of mythologies, the Titans of Greece and all this kind of stuff. And that's scary because, if you believe the Bible's word of God, you don't want them getting myths from other pagan myths, right? But as you seek, so my journey has been heavily influenced by my desire to understand the Bible within its own ancient context rather than imposing my modern Western American context on it. So when we read these verses in English, we think of whatever, way that we want to characterize and understand it to make sense with our theology, rather than saying, well, how did they see it in those days? Is there phrases, are there references to concepts that are not readily understood by us? As we all know, just different cultures and different time periods have many sayings and many concepts that they understand. They understand the world differently, right? So as I seek to understand it within that context, that's what made me drawn more to that understanding. And so, it's not like it's arbitrary either, because not only is there a long history of this understanding, but if you think about it, it's sort of like, by the time they get into the promised land and the spies come back and they say the Anakim are there and they're giants, they come from the Nephilim. Well, the only other place in the Bible where the Nephilim is described is in the days before Noah, right? And so there's this connection. Well, it's clearly giants, in Numbers, that word means giants. And there's also, it's interesting, there's an Aramaic version of the word that is clearly giants, along with the Hebrew word that some people say, oh, it doesn't mean giants. Nephilim means fallen ones or something like that. Well, the Aramaic is giants, and they're described as giants. So, it kind of, I work backwards from Numbers and Joshua's conquest, and you go, yeah, okay, it clearly says that these people are tall like the cedars, and or whatever, they're large people and stuff. And what's the point? Is it just, oh, these are, because Joshua 11, it talks about like Joshua consciously going around and hunting out all the Anakim who were described as giants. He's deliberately trying to get rid of them. That's what he's cleansing the land of. And a lot of these tribes that he wipes out all of them, it's the Anakim. Or they have their tribes like Zamzumim and Emim, and these are known tribes of giants, right? And they're described as such elsewhere in the Bible. And so what is that? And then, of course, Goliath is one of them. And by the time of David, they're also called Rephaim. That's another kind of term. A lot of background to all this. But nonetheless, Goliath was not just an anomaly. And what you see is these Nephilim, these giants creatures, are this spawn of, yeah, I know it sounds like a Marvel comic book, and I know it sounds like a mythology, but it's like, yeah, angels mating with human beings, and that violation of the heavenly earthly divide creates that hybrid that is not acceptable to God. And that's one of the main reasons why he's cleansing the promised land of that violating hybrid, and it says in Joshua 11, it says that he got rid of all the Anakim in the land except for the land of Philistia. He's like, what? He left them there. Well, whatever. Hey, Bible characters don't always do everything they're supposed to do. They're not perfect, whatever. But interestingly, what then is who are one of the dominant people groups or clans that when David becomes Messiah king of Israel, who is it that he wipes out? The Rephaim. And the Rephaim are basically those giants, of which Goliath was one, and his brother was another. And then there's other giants that, the book of Chronicles and Samuel talks about these giants hunting David, trying to kill him, and David's mighty men kill them instead, right? And so it's like, and then once David destroys, finishes, you get to the end of David's story, and he wipes out the Rephaim in the land. After that point in time, you never hear about giants in the Bible anymore. And it's kind of interesting because that's the point, was that Messiah was supposed to clear the land of giants. Now, there's a whole other thing with Jesus later, but I don't want to talk about that right now because it'll get complicated. But right now, that's the concept. So, like, the whole point was that God was going to clean that land out for his Messiah to come and rule in the land, and David becomes the antitype of the ultimate Messiah king, right? So that's the kind of theological thread that is going on there, and I think that's just it explains a lot of anomalies in the Bible. Like I said, here, let me give you this one passage. This is really wild because, like, when I read it, it kind of shocked me because I hadn't really, I guess I'd read over it. So like I said, there's a couple passages in 1 Chronicles 20, 2 Samuel 21, 1 Chronicles 11, where he describes these. Now, the phrase here is descendants of the giants in some translations. So it says, Ishbi-Benob, 2 Samuel 21:16. Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants whose spear weighed 300 shekels, which is basically the same as Goliath, right? And it's like, okay, this is heavy, this is large. He thought to kill David. But Abishai killed him. Then another David's men kills Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And then Elhanan kills a man of great stature who had 6 fingers, a nameless one. Okay, so there's several of these men that are described as descendants of giants, and the actual Hebrew behind that is like, could actually be, I've read some scholarship on it where it's like, it could actually be son of Rapha. And Rapha is the base word for Rephaim, which were the giants of David's day. But there's one scholar that made a really interesting argument that Sons of Rapha was a technical term about a military squad. So you've got a military squad of assassins hunting David. I mean, that's in there. I'm not like imposing, right?
Yeah.
So that's the story I told in my novel, David Ascendant. Everybody tells the story of David and Bathsheba. If you go on Amazon and look in the Bible fiction categories, all the Bible stories are all stories about women like Bathsheba and Rachel and all this, written by women for women, right? And then all of a sudden, my novels are the only ones, one of the few that end up getting on there because they're more about the biblical heroes. But this is a story, you hear the story about Bathsheba, you hear a story about David's rise, and even killing Goliath, right? But who's told the story of these 5 giants? Like I said, Chronicles 11, First Chronicles 11, Second Samuel 21, and First Chronicles 20 talk about these various giants. One of them's an Egyptian who has 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, and he's about over 7 feet tall. Now, when I say giants here, I don't mean like 20 foot tall. Like when we think of giants, this is another American thing, right, or a Western thing. You use the
this is
English
Andre
word,
the Giant.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a 6'5" basketball player is a giant, because especially if you think about the average height back then was like 5'5".
Yes.
So a 6'5" person is considered a giant, is a very tall person. So that's another example where these English words create in our minds a false picture that the Bible is really not saying. So these are tall men. Sometimes Goliath was 9 feet tall. This Egyptian man was like 7.5, I think, something like that. Those are the only ones that are given dimensions. But it's not that fantasy image, right?
Right.
And my point here is that those are the stories that I'm telling, and they really are there in the Bible. They're just, when you don't do the study, you don't know it. Like you're reading these clans and like, the Emim and the Zamzumi. Well, if you look closely in other passages, it'll say, the Emim are like the Zamzumim, who are like the Anakim, which are the giants. And so you put 2 and 2 together when you're reading this stuff, and you find that there's either multiple clans of giants, or there are several words in different countries. The Ammonites and the Moabites might use different terms, but for the same creatures, So that's sort of some of the rambling of that. Now, if there's something specific that you're thinking of you'd like me to address, I'd be happy to do so.
No, I think that was absolutely great. I wanted to hear your take on it, your philosophy on it, and kind of where your biblical basis comes from. Because
Sure.
I think that's important when we look at any literature, knowing where the author is coming from. And I talk with people all the time about that. It's like they'll say, "Well, this author says this." Well, let's talk about that author real quick and see where their background's from. You talked about a movie about the Exodus, made by atheists, written by an atheist, directed by an atheist, produced and distributed by atheists. What are we going to expect? Aronofsky's Noah movie. What exactly did we expect? Because I knew about Aronofsky. I had read the graphic novel he produced before the movie. I knew exactly what was going to be in that movie before it ever came out, because I had read to see who the author is. So I love what you've shared. You definitely have done your study, and you have a good basis for why you believe what you believe.
Sure. And I just want to say, it's not unreasonable it's not unreasonable at all for Christians to expect that if you're going to tell our stories, you should be consistent with the original material. For instance, that's what they say about the Marvel stories, right? Comparing it to the original material. That's what they say about Lord of the Rings. Well, does it match the original material? And all of a sudden the Bible's like, oh, come on. You don't expect them to be match the original material. Well, I don't, because I know that, if you hate God, you're not gonna want to be consistent with the original material. I get that. But the point is, though, if you look in history, a lot of unbelievers made a lot of biblical movies in the past, and they weren't that bad. They weren't that off. Of course,
Right.
they're not perfect, but in other words, the point here is that it's not unreasonable to be an audience of a particular type of material and want to have that want to have it consistent, because think about it. If you went too far off of J.K. Rowling's, Harry Potter, people wouldn't watch the movie and you'll not make money. So do you want to make money? Well, then be consistent with the material. And that's kind of the context of how I see it, but you're right. I do think, especially even more so now, don't expect it to ever be consistent. The one exception might be that there are still some Christian labels in Hollywood, like Sony Affirmed Films. I know the producers there, and they're Christians, and they've put out some good stuff. And they're working on one of my Bible movies that I've written, based on the book of Ruth. Now, they bought it from me, and I never heard from them again. So I don't know if they've changed it, and maybe, they may believe in God, but they also may have been rewritten for feminists. I don't know, because that's what most Hollywood stuff is these days. Even the Christian stuff can be infected by that, but maybe not. I'm hoping that maybe not. Maybe it'll be a good adaptation. But in general, I don't expect that anymore. I don't expect it to be ever. In fact, I'm surprised when I do see movies or series where they do have some very, what I would argue be a Christian worldview, at least in a general sense. It's not going to be about Jesus dying for your sins, but the worldview of positive marriage, positive biblical understanding of marriage and gender and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, wow, it's pretty amazing. Like the classic example, the King Richard movie, which was fantastic. It was my favorite movie of the year until Coda came out. And it's like, it's not at all woke. It's not at all the leftist Hollywood paradigm of, blacks are the oppressed people. It's like the way that you overcome is not being a victim. It's working harder than everybody else. And that is that's a Christian value, Same thing with Coda, like I have to admit, I was surprised it won the Oscar. Yes, on the surface, it has the woke elements of having a marginalized people group of the deaf community, but Christians don't care about that. We love that, It's as long as it's a great story and it has some positive family values in it, which it did, and it also had a little bit feminist in there, but it's no one's expecting perfection. I just have to admit that it wasn't woke enough to win the Oscar. You look at all the other movies and they are, and it's like, okay, sometimes even Hollywood gets it right. I have to admit that, right? So, it's an interesting world out there right now with movies. And,
well, and since we're on that subject, if you've got a few more minutes, I love the idea of your book, Hollywood Worldviews, watching film with wisdom and discernment. When you wrote that book, what was kind of your goal?
Well, I had two goals, because it was written quite a while ago,
Right.
over 15, 18 years ago now.
Yeah.
But and I did do an upgrade of it at some point in time. But it was twofold. One was that was when I was first learning my craft of screenwriting, and I was also crafting my aesthetic. And what that means is an aesthetic is your philosophy of beauty. And as a Christian, I have a biblical aesthetic, and I was trying to understand how those two fit together well. And my conclusion was that, at least Western storytelling really does reflect a Christian worldview in and of itself. Like, that whole, the medium is the message, Well, yeah, in a very real sense, the hero's journey, contrary to what Joseph Campbell was real famous for a while because of his relativistic monomyth and all this stuff. But the truth is the hero's journey is a reflection of the Christ story. And so in a very real sense, and storytelling is about conversion or redemption.
Yeah.
And so these are things that are not intrinsically Christian necessarily, but certainly if you're telling a conversion or a redemption story, the Christian worldview fits with that concept very well if you understand how to do it, right? And
Yes.
so I wanted to work that out and put it down on paper, because the act of like writing it out helps you organize your thoughts more as a writer. And then secondly was I did want to help the church at the time. Like I said, my past had been, now this, like I said, this is more like 30 years ago or whatever, but I the evangelical past had the whole thing about movies, where it's like, oh, movies are too much, there's sex and violence, and look, there is a problem with sex and violence in movies, but it was the throw the baby out with the bathwater, and a lot of Christians had that concept where they were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But then there was also the new wave of Christians that were saying, well, I'm free in Christ. I don't have those judgmental things. It's just entertainment. So it doesn't affect me, right? And I felt like there's those extremes in the church that I wanted to address and say, no, both sides are wrong. It does affect you, and you have to be consciously aware of what's going on, because if you aren't, you are being controlled, you're being manipulated. Now, and the more conscious you are aware of what they're trying to do, the less likely you are to be affected by it. And the more able you are then to be able to interact critically with it, appreciate the good, reject the bad. And that becomes also a way to talk to other people, did you see at the water cooler, did you see the Marvel movie last night? It's like, yeah, well, here's what I thought about it. Here's what I liked. Here's what I didn't like. Here's where I thought that they were saying moral values that are bad or whatever. And look, now like I say, I think it's real common. A lot of Christians are totally aware of that. When I wrote the book, I felt like we didn't have that. Again, we got lots of books now written by all these Christian professors in film studies in class, but back in my day, nothing existed. And so I wrote that as a Christian screenwriter to help the church to be able to appreciate movies and not be manipulated by them, but also not throw out everything just because it's not perfect. Like, do you walk away from a sermon and leave a church if you don't agree with everything in the sermon? Well, I don't. I don't always agree with everything in sermons, but I don't walk out because of it. Do you, do you have friends who are fornicators or homosexuals or whatever that you don't agree with their lifestyle, but you still are their friend like Jesus was? Well, then how can we also interact with the art where, okay, I don't agree with what they're doing here with that, but I like this. They exalt marriage, or they exalt self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice is a Christian value, right? And so why can't you appreciate that if it's so powerful and true? A classic example that I used in the book or in my talks where I go to churches is a while ago, Schindler's List. I remember that I actually had been on a, radio show about this, and they had people call in, and one woman said, I turned off Schindler's List, when they had the nude moment in there, because that's wrong and stuff. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like I said, when they're showing the Jews in the camps being stripped naked, that's not sexual, and that's making it look really evil, and that's a good thing. It's just no, that's not it. There's a moment where Schindler was sleeping with a woman, and she gets out of bed, and you see like literally 1 or 2 seconds of her, and I'm like, well, look, I'm not going to defend that as if you have to, because I don't think you have to have that in there, but I said, so you're going to throw out an entire movie that is about the powerful moral message about the Holocaust because of 2 seconds that you didn't like? I'm like, no, I'm sorry. There's something morally wrong with that, and that you don't have to agree with it in order to be able to draw the good from the bad. Now, there comes a point where if the bad becomes so overwhelming, I get that. That's where it's not black cut and dry. It's not black and white. Yes, or shall I say, yes, if something becomes very pornographic, then I totally get it, because in and of itself, if you're having all these, like some people make good arguments about Game of Thrones, or some of these modern day series where they're very pornographic, and it's like, okay, there's a good argument there not to watch some of that stuff. But you have to deal with each of these things on an individual basis. You can't just, sex and violence in the movies, I don't watch them anymore, that kind of thing.
I'm right there with you. I couldn't get past the first episode of Peacemaker because of that.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And by the way, I would say that now there are more of these where I'm probably a lot, because I've been in the business and I have to watch a lot of stuff that other people would not watch, and
Yes.
sometimes I go, man, I shouldn't have watched that, but you have to be on top of things and all that,
Yes.
but even then I have my standards. But I agree with you that more and more of these series now, I too am like, you're watching the first episode and you're just like, this is just way over the top, pornographic, or worse, it's just nihilistic. This is the thing that I think is far worse than pornography, is nihilism, where it's like, and by the way, that Peacemaker, in my opinion, it's very nihilistic, where it's just all these jokes about death and murder, and it's just jokey death and murder. And it's like, I remember Pulp Fiction. That was my argument against Pulp Fiction. It was a masterpiece on one level, but it would really disturb me at how callous it was about death. But he was also making a certain moral point about it. But now it's like they revel in it, and they actually. It's more of an expression of the depravity of the filmmakers than anything. It's not exploring the dark irony of man's soul. It's really just, these people are dark, and that they think that's funny. I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, I'm the same way. And being in the position I am, leading a group of Christian nerds, I've got 15,000 followers in my Facebook group, and people listening to the podcast. I have taken upon myself from time to time to simply say, I watched it so you don't have to.
Yeah. No, totally.
Yeah. So, but I'm right there with you. There are some things that I can say. I can take. I grew up in the 80s. You take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have the facts of life. I can sift through the good and the bad. And recently, you were talking about, you sift through those, and you're able to maturely say, these are the things that I think are morally good about this, and here are the things that I morally disagree with. Recently had Ted Turneau, the writer of the Pop Culture Parent, and we had a good discussion about, when you watch something like this with your children, this is an opportunity for you to have these conversations that need to be had.
Yes, I do. That's the thing about. Look, it makes parenting harder because you got to get more involved and watch more of the stuff, but you also need to be listening to their music. And it's not about saying, I listen to that song, that's bad. It's about saying, so I listen to that song you like. So what do you think about the lyrics where it says, oh, you're a hoe and whatever, you're a hoe and I'll beat you up. Like, so do you think that that's a good value that you want to have? These are the questions you could ask, and I bet you that has probably more effective than canceling it and saying, no, you're not going to watch that or listen to that stuff, Of course, obviously each kid you have to parent each kid at different levels.
Exactly.
But yeah.
Is it bad that I used to listen to my kids' music so I could sing it in the car to annoy them and their friends?
Well, hey, listen, I'll listen to songs like when I was a kid. Like I stopped listening to modern music, decade ago. But and of course my era was the 70s, right?
Yeah.
And but I didn't listen really closely to a lot of those lyrics.
Yes, I was the same way.
Yeah, and so even
you hear a song today and go,
yeah, exactly.
Did I really listen to that?
It's more explicit now, but even the implied thing is, I did that recently where it's like just this great catchy tune from the late 60s or early 70s, and it was a different drum. You and I traveled to the beat of a different drum, and it's a famous song by a One Trick Pony band or something, but it was written by Michael Nesmith of the Monkees, which is like, that guy was a genius songwriter, and it's so catchy, but I didn't know what the lyrics were. So I looked them up, I started reading them and singing along with it. I realized, oh man, this is about a narcissistic, selfish man who's trying to get rid of the woman because he wants to just keep sleeping around. And I'm like, I don't want to sing that song, and it's interesting.
Yeah, it is It is a fascinating world that we live in, especially when we deal with entertainment on a regular basis, and we create stories for people. And I am excited about what you do, Brian. I love the work you're doing. One last question: is there something on the cusp? Is there a new book coming out that we don't know about yet that you are allowed to talk about?
No, my latest book is the two books is the Moses novel and then the Spirit World of Moses. Actually, I did write recently. I just wrote a booklet. I also do booklets on little theological, interesting, imaginative theology things. Like I wrote a booklet on Leviathan and Behemoth, the two chaos monsters in the Bible. Just fascinating stuff. But I am working on my next novel. I'm not ready to talk about which one it is. It's in Chronicles of the Watchers.
Okay, great.
But I actually might be working on two novels this year because I want to write a novel. I have a story that I've had for a long time, and it is a script already, but I want to turn it into a novel. It's about a serial killer. So it's a thriller, totally different genre than what I've done. But I'm not ready to talk about them in detail. I'm still just in research mode. So it's going to take a few months before I can really get moving.
Well, definitely let me know when you're ready to talk about them. I would love to have you back on the show. Brian, it has been a joy having you today. And anything else to share with us? Well, one last thing is if people want to follow you, how can they keep track?
That's exactly what the last thing is I would want to say. My website's my name, Godawa.com, Godawa.com. And I've got a really interesting website. There's a lot of information there, a lot of articles related to the stories I'm writing. I cast all my novels. I got little pictures of really cool things just for people who are interested to learn more about the novels or whatever. But the truth is all my work is exclusively on Amazon.com. In all my books are in digital, paperback. Some of them are in hardback and audiobook. So it's all exclusively there. If you just go to Amazon.com and type in my name, Brian Godawa, and go to my author page, you'll have all my books and all the explanations of everything. You can just fish through those to figure out what's most interesting to you. And they're already at great discounted prices. So
awesome. Well, and I will put links down in the show notes below as well so that you can follow Brian. Brian, once again, absolutely joy having you on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Ricky.
It was great getting to know Brian Godawa. Don't forget to check out last week's episode to catch part 1 if you missed it. And don't forget to grab your copy of Brian's newest book. I've included links down in the show notes below. Next week, I'll give my review of The Batman and have a special guest, BB Nate from Tatooine Sons, to give his input as well. You don't want to miss that. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, just click all those buttons down below. That way you can keep up with us and you'll get information every time we put out new content. And you can find all of our social links to our YouTube channel and to our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. And while you're there, check out the support tab. We would love to have you as a Patreon. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Philippians 1. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. We'll see you next week. Blessings.